Well, good evening. It's wonderful to be here. It's always difficult to follow the comedy act that is Lachlan. So I first met Lachlan in Dundee. I studied with his brother Callum, who runs the work of Christian Institute, and is a good friend. I studied my law over there in Dundee, and I'm feeling the pressure now. So it's wonderful to be here. So I work with Evangelical Alliance. We've got some literature just outside if you want to understand more of what we do. Two main things are bringing the church together around unity. So I love being at services like this. One of the joys of my job is getting to travel around the country and just to hear what's going on in churches and to hear stories of people coming to faith. And the other thing we do is a lot around being a voice and engaged in the public square. So tonight I've been asked to speak around faith, equality and cakes, whatever that could possibly mean. So it's been said by some that we live in a post-truth world. And I think there is some truth to that, and that creates challenges and that creates opportunities for us as people of the truth. And so tonight I want to look at some of those ideas. What is truth? What is faith, equality, and what does it have to say in very practical matters like cakes? In these challenging and changing times that we live in, I think we have to wrestle with, as individuals and as church congregations, how do we engage with our culture? And so this post-truth idea has become the word of the year in 2016 in the Oxford Dictionary in both the UK and the US. And it was partly in response to the election of Donald Trump as president and the Brexit vote and other factors. And post-truth is defined like this: circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion that appeals to emotion and personal belief. Objective facts become less relevant. So some Christians have been talking about this idea for a while. Some people have said we're living in an era called postmodernism, where everybody has their truth and there's no objective truth. There's no real truth. Russell can have his truth, I can have my truth. And we don't try and work out what's the real truth. We just say, hey, we've got different stories, different ideas of what's going on. And as Christians, we've said, hey, you've got to be careful where that can lead to. Where there's no truth, where language loses its meaning, where marriage can be redefined, where the beginning and end of life can become blurred, where people are categorized, they're boxed up on an equalities agenda, where there's lots of talk of rights and less talk of responsibility, where trust can disappear and communities disintegrate. And so if you're a follower of the media news, you'll hear a lot about fake news these days. And so these stories are coming out and online, and some of them are just simply false, and they're designed to kind of disrupt and unsettle, and people aren't sure what's real and what's fake. And almost in that vein, I wrote an article a couple of years ago, I actually think rather boldly. The Presbyterian Reach Out magazine printed it. Some people didn't get it. The title, which will surprise you, is this: Why Can't I Be a Heterosexual Gay Man? Now, most of you know our position as Evangelical Alliance on same-sex marriage, and we've stood against that. But the reason was to say this: why can't I live in a 2-story bungalow? Why can't I be a Bible-believing, God-fearing atheist? Why can't I be a steak-eating vegetarian? Well, for good reason, because vegetarians don't eat meat. But if you're going to start redefining marriage, why can't I redefine all sorts of other bits of language? And we're trying to point out that if you begin to remove meaning from language, we can't have a conversation anymore. If you start saying, well, marriage can be between two people of the same sex, you've started to redefine that term. And now we're in this kind of post-truth fake news era where people say anything they want. And so, well, we can't even have a conversation unless we can agree. And you say, oh no, that's just your truth, I've got my truth. Well, no, at moments that begins to jar because there is objective truth. Something has really happened. And so we push around with ideas like equality. Do we mean equality of outcome or equality of opportunity? Does everybody have to have the same opportunity to get married? Well, we've already set limits on that. You can't marry your mother or your brother. You can't marry somebody under 16. Nobody says you're anti-equality for saying that that's okay and a good thing. So it can't be equality of opportunity. So what is it, equality of outcome? Do we all have to end up in the same place on the equality agenda? Well, that would mean everybody would have to be married. And that's what we call forced marriage in most situations. So what does this equality mean? It seems everybody's defining it in their own way. And so we begin to push around and say, well, if you're defining it on your own terms, then equality becomes a meaningless idea. We live in a society, whereas the judges would say everybody's doing equality in their own eyes. And so we've begun to push around this, and we're trying, as EA and others, just saying, well, hold on, this is a really dangerous place to go as a society. We're going to struggle to have conversations, we're going to lose trust, and then what does truth mean? Somebody was saying the other day that money is one of the interesting things behind that. So if I say, and take out of my pocket 2 pieces of paper, one is a tissue, which I assure you is clean and is there on purpose, and I offered you a tissue, or I offered you this piece of paper, I know which one most people are going to come looking for the £10 note. Even if I wrote, I promise to pay the bearer on this tissue, 2 pieces of paper, but we live in a system built on trust, that you trust this one has some sort of value. Because somebody's just written on it, I promise to pay the bearer £10. And so nobody wants my tissue if I offer it out there. 2 pieces of paper, but in a system built on trust, this one has some sort of value. But for how much longer if we keep messing around with language the way we are? For how much longer if we can no longer trust news sources and slowly but surely what anybody's saying? It's a very confusing society. And it's nothing new. Jesus and Pilate have this great exchange at Jesus' trial in John 18. I'm just going to read briefly. John 18, and Pilate and Jesus are having this interchange, and Pilate's saying, so are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about it? Pilate says, am I a Jew? It's your people, it's your chief priests who have handed you over to me. And so Jesus talks about his kingdom not being of this world. And Pilate says, so you're a king. And Jesus says, you're right to say I'm a king. But for this reason I was born. I have come to testify to the truth. Anyone who hears is on the side of truth listens to me. And Pilate says, what is truth? What is truth? He doesn't even understand what truth is. And so it's not a new idea. We're living in a society again where people are saying, well, what's true? In the news, is it media bias? Is it fake news? What's true? I go with some reluctance into this. I wasn't going to use this analogy. Anyway, a certain politician in North Belfast found himself on the front of a police Land Rover. Jerry Kelly. So Jerry's like this on the Land Rover, and he got a police warning, and he was being interviewed on Good Morning Ulster by Karen Patterson. And Karen said, well, Jerry, you've got this warning for obstructing a police Land Rover. And he said, no, Karen, I wasn't obstructing a police Land Rover. I was standing up for the rights of the people of North Belfast. And Karen said, okay, Jerry, but I've seen the video footage of you on top of the police Land Rover, sprawled across it like this, obstructing it. And he said, no, Karen, you've seen video footage in which you perceived me to be doing that. What I was actually doing was standing up for the rights of the people of North Belfast. And it's a classic kind of post-truth moment. He says, but I've seen the video. Oh, no, that's what you perceive. That's what you understood the video to be saying. In fact, I'm claiming to be doing something entirely different. And at that point, it's incredibly difficult to continue the conversation because language no longer has any meaning in that engagement. And so our society isn't quite sure if it wants truth. And I think this is both a problem for us in the church as people of the truth, but also a wonderful opportunity because there's a great deal of confusion out there. There's a great deal of fear. There's a great deal of uncertainty. 10 years ago, people were happy with the economic system that we had. And everybody was doing well, and people wanted on the property ladder, and things were kind of going well, and then that collapsed. And so people are a little bit more hesitant around that. And even a few years ago, politics seemed to be okay, and it was kind of calm, and not everybody you wanted was in, but it was all right. And suddenly the whole system seems up for grabs. And so lots of people I'm talking to are deeply confused. They're unsettled because they're not sure where to put their hope and their trust in moments like this. And that includes some Christians, though thankfully not too many. And that's why I want to turn to Daniel as somebody who was taken out of his context, placed in exile, and found himself in a very difficult situation. not dissimilar to the kind of changing culture. We're staying in the culture, and the culture is changing rapidly around us. It's a little bit like what Daniel experienced, being taken out of his culture and placed into a new one. And so Daniel is a kind of hero of mine in looking at the public square. Somebody taken out, he's given a 3-year degree program or apprenticeship program, and he's trained in the Babylonian ways. Many of us have been trained or send our kids off to be trained in all sorts of things that we do. And so we've got experience, we've apprenticed, we've done some qualifications, we're doing continuing professional development in the thing that we spend much of our day doing. The thing I love about Daniel is Daniel knows who he was, that identity question. He knows the story that fundamentally shapes who he is, even in exile. That great verse in Daniel 1, verse 8, and Daniel resolved not to defile himself. He knew that he was in this different culture, but he knew there was a different story deep inside his heart. He knew his identity was fundamentally connected with his relationship with God and as an Israelite young man. And so he said, I'll take on your language and culture. I'll even take on a new name. But I'm not going to take food and wine that has been offered to a false god. I'm not going to pledge my allegiance to another god. I'm not going to lose my identity in that moment. And so as we're in this changing culture, we need to know the story that shapes us. We need to get into this text. People say it all the time, oh, young people don't seem to know it as well. I'm not sure old people know it as well. Do we know this story? And does it shape all that we do? Because we carry all sorts of other identities. Protestant, Catholic, nationalist, unionists. We carry stories as a teacher or as a farmer. We have other stories on it. We have family stories placed upon us. And we have a whole variety of stories and influences that shape us. But what's the fundamental identity marker for us? Who are we in this moment? And so Daniel knew in a changing culture he needed to know his identity. He also needed to know his purpose. God isn't just interested in outcomes, but why we do what we do. Purpose drives us. What's our purpose? Daniel resolved not to defile himself. When the folks were taken off into exile, some of the prophets came and said, oh, look, we've upset God, but we'll only be here a year or two. The false prophet said. And then Jeremiah came along and he said, no, guys, we're going to be here a long time. And here's what we need to do in Jeremiah 29:7. We need to pray for the shalom of the place we have been carried into exile. Eugene Peterson, who helped with the Message translation, defines shalom in this way: the dynamic, vibrating health of a society that pulses with divinely directed purpose and surges with life-transforming love. Sometimes we translate shalom peace, and that's good in as far as it goes, but shalom is this richer, deeper idea. The exiles, Daniel and his friends, and all those who were carried off were to pray for the shalom, the flourishing, the thriving of the place in which they found themselves in exile. Not easy. These are the very people who carried them off from Israel to Babylon. And the prophets are saying, pray for them. Not just that, not just pray, but act. It says, marry and have kids. Put down roots. Plant your crops. Build your houses. Invest in that place. I think that's relevant to us. We're to pray for the place in which we find ourselves in exile, which is right here. We're finding ourselves more and more in the fringes. But we're to pray. We are to seek the dynamic, vibrating wholeness of this society. We're to act. We're to marry. We're to have kids. We're to invest. We're to plant crops. We're to build houses. We're to get stuck in and seek the well-being and the flourishing of this place. Daniel knew the story. He knew why he was doing what he was doing. And finally, he knew the power that came from that. Daniel and his friends went through this pretty tough test. My wife's from Portadown, from farming stock, so I know you're giving up meat. I find that incredibly difficult. She's got this book called The Daniel Plan. Rick Warren has managed to turn this one chapter into a big, thick book. But the bottom line is still water and vegetables. I'm not there. It's okay. Any beef farmers? For no reason, my father-in-law's a beef farmer too. But we have cut back just a little bit and begun to think a little bit more about what we eat. But the first thing I noticed is how hard that is. So Daniel and his friends get together, and so they do this 3 years of vegetable and water. But at the end of the time, they're taken before Nebuchadnezzar and the other officials. and they are found to be 10 times wiser than anybody else. And we know that Daniel's promoted to a whole series of positions. The King James calls him a satrap. There's not many satraps about today, so if you're filling in your UCAS form or whatever it's called these days. But a senior civil servant, he might even have been a SPAD, if we're allowed to talk about them, special advisors. He rose up to be kind of prime minister over a province, so he had all sorts of political roles. In fact, the last verse says he was a senior official until the time of King Cyrus. And if you've got the nearly inspired notes, it probably says somewhere at the bottom, that was the whole time they were in exile, 70 years. So Daniel was an incredibly powerful person because he excelled in what he did. But also, we read that Daniel was given the ability to interpret dreams and visions. Daniel had a supernatural power that came from God, so he understood the culture. He spent 3 years learning language and culture, as many of us do at university, and then he combined that with divine insight and wisdom, and that enabled him to speak into the culture in a different way. Real power and authority come when we combine those things. You see, the funny thing is we live in a culture that's apparently more scientific, more rational, more logical, and it feels like it's getting narrower and narrower. And yet the hit TV shows are things like Game of Thrones, Vampire Diaries, True Blood, which all have these kind of vampire, sci-fi, fantasy elements to them in apparently a more scientific, logical culture. We meet more and more people in our ministry who are dabbling in the occult. This is supposed to be a culture that doesn't believe in God anymore. But people are looking for it. They're looking for something that transcends, that cuts across, but not always in the right place. 20% of people here go to church. Roughly 70% of people want to get married in a church because they hope there's going to be some special marker at that. Nearly all births are still registered in church. People want to get baptized even though they don't believe in God. They want a funeral in a church because at that moment, nobody wants to say there's no God and nothing afterwards. And so for the young folks, when something like the Paris tragedy happens, nobody goes onto Twitter or Facebook and says, hashtag, random collection of cells have just dissolved and come back in another random collection of cells, which is what scientists believe has happened. They go, hashtag, pray for Paris. People who don't believe in God want to hope there's something more in that moment. So even if you don't have a funeral in a church, what do? You make it look like a church funeral. You read out some poetry, you have a sort of play some music that you hope feels like it's got some connection beyond. And nobody wants to say, well, that's the end, that's them, their cells have just dispersed out, done and dusted. Hashtag, pray for whatever is going on. People want there to be something more in our culture. So the science thing is interesting because it doesn't logically kind of follow through. So we sometimes in our work talk about a thing called the grid. This is kind of Google Earth view of thinking about the world. So I'm an artist, as you can see. I spent a lot of time perfecting my skills in that. This is the story of the world that I feel I'm bumping into sometimes. In media, in university, in books, and in culture. There's a story. The world's a way of saying this is the way things are. And the reason I know that is because I feel that my faith doesn't fit into that. It's not a big, wide open story that can encompass being a Christian. It has a particular story, and I'm not sure where faith goes. Is it going in parallel? Is it going the opposite direction? When I was at uni, I really wrestled with this. I kind of became compartmentalized. I was learning this new stuff as a lawyer, and I thought, this is this dominant story. Where does my faith fit? Became kind of schizophrenic for a year or two, just boxed them off until eventually I thought, that's not sustainable. I'm going to have to do something about it. Began to ask questions, and with the help of others, began to see, do you know what? The story I'm being told is not very clear. I don't actually know where it starts, the world story, the kind of dominant education story. We're just a random collection of cells. We've evolved from, we're no different than animals. We don't have any purpose. It's not actually very clear where it's heading to. What is the story of the world? What is the future? Because nobody wants to say you just die and that's the end of it. So there's a whole series of stories. These are a bit small. And anyway, nobody in Porch Church says they're a humanist. But here's the thing, if you add ism on the end, it makes you sound like you're sort of intelligent or something. Humanism's just like that we as human beings have to solve our own problems. I have lots of friends who think there's nothing else, so it's just up to us to sort stuff out, which is a bit depressing, I think, because we've tried that not very successfully. Again, very few people say they're a capitalist. I mean, that was prior to Donald Trump. People probably say he is. But that's a lot of people, a lot of my old law colleagues, who's just striving for a better life. It might be a bit brutal to say it's about money, but it's kind of about individualism, consumerism, materialism. I buy stuff. Might be good stuff. Might be a better education for their kids. They just want a nicer life, a better house for their kids. Usually it's about having a better house than the other person in the firm, just getting a slightly better car than their rivals. But it's about buying stuff, all sorts of stuff. Most of us are driven by that. Like most of the people I know are fundamentally trying to get their kids into a better education. You keep asking why? Well, so that they'll earn more money and so they'll be comfortable and happy, because money and happiness are linked. It's about getting a better life. More stuff equals better life. Agnostics or apathy for most people, I don't know and I don't care what the future holds. I don't want to think about it. It's like somewhere off there. Don't ask me hard questions. And even a few atheists who believe there is no God. And there's hundreds of isms out there. And so the story of the world maybe isn't as clear, was what I began to say. But still, where does the God story fit? I concluded it's jarring with it. It's unsettling. It's cutting across the story of the world. It starts in a radically different place with the Creator. And that frames everything. Our identity. Every single person is a divine image bearer. Everyone is made in the image of God. Everybody's wired for relationships with God, with each other, and the world He created. And we all have a sense of purpose. Like we're designed to steward and to cultivate aspects of this world. We're made to work in a broad understanding of that. And we're heading to Revelation 21, a new heavens and a new earth. And at the core of that story, it's not a surprise to me that it forms a cross, because Jesus was at the heart of that public square. He upset the story of His day. He upset the political rulers. He upset the religious rulers. And so they had Him crucified. That's what we're reading about in that courtroom scene with Pilate. It's the kind of cross-examination. And ultimately, He's crucified because He so upset the story of His day. Not just intellectually, but the way He lived. He asked questions of people. He provoked and jarred with what was going on in His public square. And so we see Him at the heart, if you like, of this public square engaging on these issues. So my father sometimes says to me, that's all very well for you. I worked very hard to send you to uni, and now you're saying stuff I don't understand. Does it make any sense, son? So here's a very practical issue we engage in our work, is human trafficking. It's the definitive black and white issue of our day. It's about the only thing everybody agrees is wrong anymore. So we're all clear human trafficking is bad. So I say to some of the other groups who work in that, can you just tell me why human trafficking is wrong? And they said, well, it's obviously wrong. Everybody agrees that. And I said, yeah, but there's a whole load of things I think is wrong that you don't agree with. And you would never let me away with saying just because. So give me the next line. Like, why is human trafficking wrong for you? Because your story is that we're just a random collection of cells. Your story is we've evolved from and we're no different than animals. You live on the evolutionary story, most of you. You don't think we've any sense of purpose. And we're driving towards capitalism, where you can buy and sell people's labor, and quite brutally, you can buy and sell sex. So why is the next stage not just to buy and sell people for sex? Why did that suddenly become a problem? Why is that the black and white issue? And they kind of squirm a bit and say, well, that's just ridiculous, it's wrong. And I say, no, you've really got to answer that, because I don't understand why it's wrong for you. You might not like the story I inhabit, the God story, but it says every single person's the divine image bearer. And any act of abuse against another human being is an act of high treason against God. Everybody's made for a relationship, male, female, exclusive, set out in Genesis 2. Everybody's made for purpose, to work, to steward, to cultivate this earth. And human trafficking breaches all three of those. Dead easy for me. That's a problem. Therefore, I think it's wrong. You can't tell me why it's wrong in your story. I was doing Nolan one day on euthanasia, child euthanasia in Belgium. A 7-year-old with a terminal illness, and they wanted to legislate to say it's okay to end that child's life. I said, it's not a specialist area for me, out of interest. Why did you have me on? The researchers said nobody else would do it. I said, surely everybody thinks it's wrong. They said they do. I said, why would they not come on? They said, because you'd be on the other side. What do you mean? Because you'd point out, me, that they had already given up on abortion or euthanasia for older people, and suddenly now it's an 8-year-old, they've got a problem, but if it's an 88-year-old, it was fine. And they know logically that makes no sense. So some of what we do is to challenge the story of the day and say, hold on, you guys are not being true to yourselves. And so we engage in this story and challenge it. Tom Wright, he's now a theologian in St Andrews, former Bishop of Durham, has this great line: the whole point of Christianity is it is a story of the whole world. It is public truth. There's no such thing as a privatized faith. There's no such thing as saying, well, this is just what I believe. The God story says if this thing's true and I believe it to be absolutely, it's true for everybody. There's no way in which this makes sense as a private thing between me and God. Jesus either died for the whole world and rose again, or not. It can't just be a private thing. And so that drives us into the public square and some of the discussions that we have. I'll skip that. And so sometimes we talk about issues in the public square. We put this language, I know it's super small, about justice, equality, freedom, and truth. Some of the issues the Bible talks about that we want to talk about and say, yes, we believe in justice, but we maybe have a different understanding than you, than what it means. And so we go after issues like pornography that we think lead and feed human trafficking. We go after equality, one of the corners of the public square, we would say one of the key things in the Bible. It's really clear that everybody's a divine image bearer. Everybody has inherent equality because of that. It's reaffirmed in the New Testament in Galatians. Neither slave nor free, male nor female, Jew nor Greek. We are all equal. But that leads in a very different way than sometimes the Equality Commission wants to go here. And so we challenge that and engage in that and say, we are equal, just don't box people up. Don't categorize people in unhealthy ways. What about an issue like abortion and putting equality right at the core of that? When does equality begin? Is everybody equal? Because some of the key political parties you're talking about equality don't want equality in the womb. We have gender-selective abortion even here, and we definitely have it throughout the rest of Great Britain. Female babies are much more likely to be terminated. So if we're serious about equality, why aren't we serious about abortion or euthanasia? If we're serious about equality, marriage is the best driver of equality in our society. Men get better jobs and take less risks when they're married. Women do better in a range of outcomes. Kids get better education and better outcomes in marriage. Nobody wants to talk about that because that's controversial. All the statistics say marriage is the best driver. So we love marriage. We celebrate it. We say the church is at the forefront of that. That's the best driver of equality in our society. Freedom. We want to have freedom. But how free are people in terms of betting, in terms of debt? Betting's the fixed odds betting terminals. In terms of choosing their identity and transgender. Is that real freedom, just to redefine yourself in such a way? And finally, truth. We're in a society that says it wants the truth, but doesn't when we hold a mirror up to it and push it back. I was once at an LGBT panel they were doing, and it was myself actually and the Catholic bishop were together on one end, and they said, would you teach same-sex relationships as normal? I said, let's talk about the age, first of all, in schools. So we agreed, like we're talking about 16, 17-year-olds. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll agree to teach that as normal if you agree that 1.3% of the population is gay. Big reaction in the room. 7%, it's 10%, it's 12%. I said, no, you know, all the statistics are categoric. And here's the thing, that's the reason why we can't teach as normal. You're not prepared to define normal. You're trying to, again, post-truth world, change the facts. You can't show me any statistical evidence. And I knew that. I was taking a slight risk. I don't want it taught in schools, but I knew they would never agree to those terms. If you teach the stats that it's 1.3%, it's not 10% of the population. And so we have those kind of conversations. So how do we engage to finish? Because I'm probably way out of time. I never agreed time. It was a great tactic, Russell. You're going to tell me, yeah, you're way over. You're right. Okay, so here's a few things just as we finish. Stop. 3 things. Confront. I think it's 3 things we need to do as we engage culture. One is to confront, one is to cultivate, and one is to create. There are issues we need to confront on. I think the church, though, has tried to confront on everything. So we try as an organization not to spend all our time confronting. We do need to call out the lies of our culture. So we put up this billboard in Belfast. 100,000 people are alive in Northern Ireland today because we didn't bring in the 67 Act. 100,000 people alive today. As 5% of the population. 1 in 10 people under 50. So during the time span that act's been in place, 100,000. Everybody here knows somebody who's alive today because we didn't bring in the 67 Act, statistically. That's an incredible sort of point, and that has caused carnage among those who want abortion here in Northern Ireland. They don't know what to do with that. And so we need to confront some of the lies that says it's a small issue, it's only a tiny thing, if you just let it in, it'll all be fine. No, it won't. No, it won't. 98% of abortions are not to do with rape or fatal fetal abnormalities, as they like to call it, or life-limiting disabilities. 98% are for all sorts of other reasons. All those folks are looking to change the law much more radically. So we need to tell a better story around issues like sex and sexuality. Great book by Glenn Harrison on that, who's been over and done some training, I know, with the Presbyterian Church. So there's issues we confront. There are issues that we cultivate. There's a resource at the back called Speak Up. We worked with Lawyers Christian Fellowship and said, you know what? There are about 1 million faith interactions a year when Christians share their faith. And about 5 of them end up in the Daily Mail because there's a problem. There is still a problem. We do need to talk about it. But the other 999,995 are fine. The reason most people are not sharing their faith is not the law. The law is almost always on your side unless you really, really push it. It's because we're not sharing our faith. It's us. So this is a short resource just to say, do you know what? In your home, on the street, in your work, you have a great deal of freedom to share your faith. The one thing I'd say about your workplace is the more you talk about Jesus, the safer you are. It's the people who just suddenly come in and one morning and go, boom, that cause the problem. If you've been talking about him endlessly every day, all day, and then somebody complains, you're in the clear. So let's talk more about Jesus. So we cultivate what's already there. There's freedom of speech in our society, and we love it. We say, great, let's go and let's make sure we have more of that. Let's use the opportunities that we have to share our faith. We must give that. And the final one is create. There are moments when we create and we put something new out there. Got some friends who set up a thing called Home for Good around adoption, trying to get the church more engaged in adopting and fostering. 12,000 people across the UK waiting to be adopted. There are 12,000 churches. If every church got together and took one and just kind of, on average, we could solve that problem and change the debate. Wouldn't that be a great thing for the church to be known as? Yes, we object to how you're redefining marriage. We stick to that. But yes, also, we are one of the primary drivers to solve the issues around fostering and adoption in our society. The stories we want to tell. As we understand the story that shapes us, as we get to grips with this text, we are equipped then to confront sometimes on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, to cultivate on freedom of speech and all sorts of other issues around elections and marriage and family. Most people want to get married in a church, so we run the best marriage courses. Most people have kids, so let's run the best parenting courses because we believe those are God-given things. So let's cultivate what's already good in society, and the odd time we create something brand new, brilliant ideas out of the box. CAP, brilliant debt counselling service. Home for Good, a fantastic fostering and adoption service. Like, let's run some of the best stuff out there, offering radical dissimilarity and hopeful promise. Because here's the thing, in a post-truth world, it's almost easier to be the church. As the world becomes more and more confused and chaotic, it's kind of easier to be this alternative community. I really do believe as we remain people of the truth in these moments, and as the transgender debate and same-sex marriage and some of these things unfold and move out to their logical consequences, and I could speak more and more now, if you want to ask questions about where that's going, if you redefine gender, then you can't be surprised that you bump into a president who also deals in alternative facts. You go around the far side of the moon, and on the far side you meet another guy who redefines facts, and they can't cope with each other. Both of them are redefining language. And in the midst of that, the people who hold true say, these are our convictions, this is what we believe, are going to come out of that in a different way. We offer radical dissimilarity and hopeful promise to a society that has very little else. And that is how I think we can have our cake and eat it.